Hello, everybody. Jason Wheeler here, one of the pastors at North Park Church in Columbus, Nebraska, and I've got your life group lesson here again for the week. And as always, I am very grateful to be here with you guys doing that. And we're in our Kingdom series. I know that you guys know that. We're at week 143 of our Kingdom series. That's 143 weeks of studying straight through the Gospel of Matthew, one verse at a time. And this week, we're looking at Matthew chapter 16, verses 21 through 23. Some really, really powerful stuff here. A really, really powerful message that Pastor Lynn preached on Sunday. And I hope that you guys are excited to dig into this, kind of really go a bit deeper personally with this lesson as we talk about the mindset for God's will. Considering God's will, discerning God's will. How valuable is that, right? Something we hear about a lot, but how accurate are we in our endeavors to discern God's will? Where is our mindset with that? So, of course, we've got a great example that Jesus and Peter give us in our verses today. So I'm going to go ahead to get started and read those verses out loud. Again, Matthew 16, 21 through 23. You see them on the screen right there in front of you, and I'm sure that you guys have your copies of God's Word open as well. As I read them, follow along, and then we will go ahead and jump right into those discussion questions. So here we go. Excuse me. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, Far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you. But he turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan, you are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. Okay, again, powerful verses there. What do we see? Right on the heels of last week, Peter confessing, stating clearly that he knows Jesus is the Messiah that has been foretold of in the Old Testament. He knows this for certain, and Jesus says, You're blessed, Peter, because a man didn't reveal this to you, but God did, right? And then right on the heels of that, we see Jesus for the first time state explicitly that he is going to suffer and then die. He's alluded to it previously, saying things like the temple will be torn down and then rebuilt, and he again alludes to this, but for the first time ever, he just puts it out there plainly. This is what's going to happen. This is his will. And Peter does not like what he hears, and he decides that he's going to tell Jesus that no, this is not, in fact, his will, right? And he gets in the way of that. So some great verses. And to jump into our discussion questions. So we're talking about the mindset for God's will, specifically looking at God's will. How do we know God's will? How frequently should we be looking at it? Let's go ahead and think about this, talk about this for question one. The question is this: how frequently do you consider God's specific will for your life? How often? Daily, weekly, monthly, hourly, minute by minute? How frequently do you honestly consider God's specific will for your life? And what does that consideration look like? How frequently should you consider it? Kind of consider those things as you're praying about that and talking about that question. Go ahead and do that now. Okay, so hopefully we're really looking at that, willing to look at it honestly. God has a very specific will for each and every one of us in every aspect of our life. Be that the things that we consider big, jobs, relationships, moves, things like that, all the way down to the things that we tend to consider completely insignificant. What are we going to buy at the grocery store? Or what's God's will for the very next thing that comes out of my mouth? What's God's will for the way that I handle coworkers, kids, parents, etc., etc. In all things, with prayer and supplication, make our requests known to God, right? Pray without ceasing. We need to be speaking to him and considering his will all of the time. And the truth is, knowing that God has a very specific will for each and every one of us in every aspect of our life, how do we really think that we're honestly following Christ if we're not considering that on a moment-to-moment basis? So, we're talking about God's will, and remember that we're also talking about mindset. So as we go through these questions, kind of consider how frequently you're considering his will, but also think about, ask God to make clear to you what mindset you really have. Is your mind set on the Spirit, big capital S, the Spirit of God, or is it set on the flesh? Is your mind determined and set on seeking, finding, and accepting God's will, regardless of what that looks like, or is your mind set on pleasing yourself, pleasing the flesh? These are things to consider as we move forward. Okay. And remember, going back to your outline, back to the message, right before we jump into question 2 here, there were 3 principles concerning God's will that we clearly learned from this message. One was that God's will is tough to find without his word. Even though most people are claiming to know it or trying to find it apart from his word, the truth is it is near impossible to discern God's will without his word. The second principle concerning God's will that we saw in our key verses was that good will does not make something God's will. Just because it's a good thing to do, a helpful thing to do, a kind thing to do, a seemingly caring and considerate thing to do, does not mean that it's God's will. And the third principle regarding God's will that we saw from the message is that people who are not in God's will are a hindrance to those who are. And we see that, in our key verses. Peter clearly knows God's word. He knows that Jesus is in fact the Messiah that's been foretold. And at the same time, he knows that the prophecy regarding the Messiah is that he would die, and yet he's not thinking of that. He's disregarding that. He's overlooking that. God's word doesn't mean anything to him in these passages, does it, when he rebukes Jesus? And we see that he, to a large extent, Peter's probably trying to do a good thing. He loves Jesus. He wants Jesus to stick around. He's thinking of how seemingly beneficial it would be were God's will not that Jesus dies, right? He's got good will. That doesn't make it God's will. And then the fact that he strays from God's will makes him a hindrance to Jesus, right? He gets in the way. And how do we know that? Because Jesus says that. So those are the 3 principles. That being said, let's move on to question 2 here. What does it look like to seek God's will apart from his word? What happens? What are the ramifications of doing that for yourself, for those around you, for society? And then how might you be doing that? How might you be seeking God's will apart from his word? And maybe you even taken it a step further. How might you already be assuming to know his will apart from his word? So what does that look like? What happens when God's will is sought or assumed apart from his word? And then how might you be making those mistakes? Pray about that and talk about that now. Okay, and for question 3, we talked in the message about 3 ways that God's word helps us to discern his will. One was that it informs the mind, right? It tells us the truth, makes the truth clear, shows us God's will, God's character plainly in black and white in his word. Second, it transforms the mind. And that's true, right? Transformed by the renewing of your mind. And that comes through the word of Christ. And then it submits the mind. That means that God's word then causes an obedience in our mind, a willing obedience to obey those commands, and those commands are not burdensome, right? So those were the 3 ways God's word helps us discern his will: informs the mind, transforms the mind, and submits the mind. For question 3 then, can you give an example of each of those from your life? Can you give an example of each of the 3 ways God's Word helps us to discern His will? And then which of those 3 stands out to you most and why? Pray about that. Talk about that now, please. Okay, moving on to question 4 then. In verse 22, what's going on with Peter? Put yourself in his shoes. What's he thinking? What's he worried about? What's he hopeful for? What's he trying to avoid? Why is this happening? What are the ramifications of what's going on here? What are the potential ramifications, anyway, of what's going on here? You know, many questions that we could be asking ourselves as we read through these key verses, focus specifically on what's going on in verse 22, and then answer this question, question 4. What is going on with Peter in verse 22, and how are you capable of the same? How have you found yourself in the same spot, making the same mistakes, with the same misunderstanding or wrong heart as Peter? And how might you even be doing that today, right now? Consider that, pray about that, talk about that now. Okay, so Peter's a hindrance, isn't he? You know, he's not trying to be. We know that an amazing thing just happened in the verses previous to this, and I think a principle that we see there that we can all probably relate to is that something wonderful seems to happen. We feel strengthened, we feel encouraged, and man, on the heels of that, pride sure can set in and cause us to maybe have a sort of wrong boldness or assumption in our own ability or importance, right? And then, just like Peter, maybe we can sort of take the reins, and maybe it's even with goodwill, but based in fear, based in an assumption that God's will would or wouldn't be something specific. And then what we see is that Peter's a hindrance, right? Getting in the way. So, you know, we can be capable of the same thing. We need to be careful of that. So moving on to question 5, keeping all of this in mind then, according to the evidence, would you say that for the most part, your mind is set on the flesh or spirit? Is your mind set on seeking, finding, accepting, walking into the will of God in all circumstances? Or is your mind set on your flesh, your circumstances, how to arrange them according to your understanding, how to feel better? You guys get the picture. According to the evidence, which would you say your mind is truly set on, flesh or spirit? Pray about that. Be willing to be honest and talk about that now. Okay, and for question 6, Pastor Lynn read these passages, or these verses, in the message on Sunday, 1 Peter 2, verses 20 through 21. And really, he started about halfway through verse 20 there, and you guys can go ahead and do the same thing. And he made a statement that said, those verses can be great at ministering to us when we're struggling with what we're talking about here today. And that just really stood out to me and was really encouraging, and those verses stood out to me. So bearing that in mind, for question 6, our final question here, how do those verses, 1 Peter chapter 2, starting about halfway through verse 20 and then into 21, how do those verses relate to our lesson? And then think about this. In what specific area of your life do you need God's will, wisdom, and peace right now? What situation? What area? And then how can this lesson minister to, help you with, and then give direction with that situation? So read those verses. How do they relate to this lesson? And then in what specific area of your life right now do you need God's will, wisdom, and peace? How can this lesson minister to and give direction with that specific situation? And then, of course, as you walk away from this lesson, really bear the questions in mind. How frequently do I consider God's will for my life? What is my mind really set on? And then what do I need to ask God to help me with? In what way can my prayer be educated now to move forward with that situation? Maybe you never consider it. Maybe you need to start at the cross and beg for salvation. Maybe you know Jesus, but you realize that you've got some work to do. I think that if all of us are desperate for God's will in our life, we should land on that we want sanctification. We want to grow no matter where we're at. So consider that as you leave this lesson, as you leave your group, as you go home, as you move into the days beyond this one. Well, that's it for today, guys. As always, again, very grateful to have been here with you. It's been a pleasure. You know how to get a hold of me. Check out the website, www.insidenp.com. All of our content is there, and you can contact any of us pastors there as well. And Lord willing, I will be back with you guys next week.